At Friday's non-tender deadline, the Orioles cut ties with one player, but it maybe wasn't the one that we had expected. I'll tell you why the Orioles decided to non-tender Jacob Webb coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Monday, November 25th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb. And coming up on today's episode, we're going to take a look at the roster decision the Orioles made on Friday, non-tendering Jacob Webb and making him a free agent 2 years earlier than he would have been set to hit the open market. We'll talk about why the O's made that decision and why it may have had a little bit to do with the injury issues he had this year. Then we'll dive into the other players that the Orioles did tender a contract to and kind of what their situations look like going into 2025. And then there were some other interesting non-tenders around the league. We'll chat about the newest free agents and which ones the Orioles could be going after. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So we're going to begin this one with the biggest news from the weekend. 8 p.m. Eastern time on Friday evening was the non-tender deadline. And the Orioles made one somewhat surprising decision at that deadline. But first, let's talk about what is a non-tender. What does that mean? Well, the Orioles had 13 arbitration-eligible players on their roster at the point on Friday. They had a few more at the end of the season. Some of them have already been DFA'd, hit free agency, whatever it may be. But they ended up with 13 of them that were arbitration eligible. So how does this process work? Well, in your first through your third years in Major League Baseball, after you get called up, players generally make somewhere near the league minimum. It goes up and up every year, but you're not making a whole lot of money by baseball standards. But in years 4 through 7, remember these quote unquote rookie contracts in the major leagues last sometimes 6, but mostly 7 years before you can become a free agent. In years 4, 5, 6, and 7 in the big leagues, you hit the arbitration process. What does that mean? Well, it means you make an amount of money each year that's completely based on your performance in the previous season, with the only caveat being once you make an amount in arbitration one year, say you get awarded $2 million in arbitration for your 4th year in the big leagues, you cannot make any less than that the next year. So even if you tank, you're horrible, you get sent back down to AAA, the lowest you can make for that following year is still $2 million. And that is how this process works. They look at stats and how a player performs. And if you quote, tender a contract to an arbitration eligible player, so someone between years 4 and 7, you are then just agreeing to keep them on your roster, at least for now, and come to an agreement later in the offseason on the amount of money they will make next season. And that amount of money is based on their stats from this year. So generally, the team and the player end up agreeing to a number that makes sense based on their stats, and that's what the player gets paid next year. But if they don't agree, sometimes they will take it to a neutral third party who will hear the arguments from the player, hear the arguments from the team, and they will decide what that contract figure will be for the player in the next season. Now, more often than not, the teams do just agree with each other, but sometimes they go to arbitration, which is why the process is called this, and that third party comes in and kind of makes that money decision. So the non-tender deadline, which came on Friday at 8 o'clock, is basically the deadline for the teams, and is the first step in this entire arbitration process. Deadline for teams to decide, hey, you know what? I don't even want to go to arbitration. I don't even want to come up with a contract figure for this player. I just want to release them and make them a free agent earlier than they were set to actually hit free agency. It's kind of like in the NFL, when you just end up cutting players in the offseason or in training camp or releasing players for just salary cap purposes. It's kind of the closest thing that baseball has to that is non-tendering a player. So to non-tender a player is basically just releasing a guy before that quote-unquote rookie contract of 7 years is done. And it is usually when you don't want to pay him the amount of money you think he'll probably make in that arbitration process. So this does happen because the arbitration salary can't go down from year to year. So sometimes maybe you have a player who made $5 million in arbitration last year, and then this year he was horrendous. Like maybe you're thinking about leaving him on the team, but he's worth nowhere close to 5 million, but he has to get paid at least that in arbitration. You say he might not even make the team. We're not going to promise him 5 million. We're just going to non-tender him. We don't have to pay him at all anymore, and we send him into free agency. And that is usually what happens. It's either a down year or sometimes a non-tender comes because of an injury thing. You know, maybe a guy made $6 million last year, but he's dealing with an injury. There's a good chance he's going to miss most of next season. You're just like, well, he's not really going to help us next year. And in no way is he going to help us for, $6 or $7 million. We're not even sure how much he'll play for us next year. We're just going to send him into free agency. Sometimes those teams then work out a separate deal with the player to bring them back for less money. But the first step in the process is that non-tender. And for the Orioles, they had 13, as I mentioned, arbitration-eligible players that they had to make that first decision with on Friday. It was either tender them a contract, basically agree to, hey, we're bringing you back next year. We'll figure out that number dollar sign wise later. Or B, we're going to non-tender you. We're going to send you directly to free agency earlier than you thought. And the only player that the Orioles non-tender, they tendered 12 contracts of the 13 players. The only non-tender was right-handed reliever Jacob Webb, as the Orioles have set him to now become a free agent 2 years earlier than he was expected to. Now, MLB Trade Rumors does a great job of projecting out these arbitration salaries, what each player could make. And Jacob Webb was only projected to make $1.7 million in 2025. And for a guy who has been a good middle reliever for the last season and change for the Orioles, especially with a new owner in David Rubenstein, $1.7 million is absolutely nothing for a player who is helping your ball club try to win a World Series. So because of that, I can't imagine this decision had really anything to do with money. It tells me it had something to do with performance and mostly the injury issues that Webb dealt with this year. To me, this feels very similar to the surprising decision the Orioles made earlier this offseason when they declined the $4 million team option on Danny Coulomb, because Coulomb missed like 3 months this year with that elbow injury. When he came back, his stuff was not the same, but the argument was like, it's $4 million for a reliever who's maybe been your best reliever over the past year. Like, it's $4 million, even if he's not himself, at least take a chance. But the Orioles must have felt that the injury was so demoralizing to his future outlook in his mid-30s. They just declined that option on Coulomb and made him a free agent. Now they could always try to bring Danny back for less money. But for Webb, it's even less because Coulomb was $4 million. Jacob Webb was 1.7. And that's what tells me it's something very similar there. Now, Webb missed about 6 weeks this season, from August to September, with elbow inflammation. That was the same injury that it was initially ruled for Danny Coulomb when he went out. Now, it turned out Coulomb needed surgery, had to get bone chips out of his elbow. He was out for a much longer time than Webb was. Webb didn't get surgery. He did come back in mid-September. And when he came back, like, his velocity and spin rate, they were a little bit down on all of his pitches, but not nearly to the level that the stuff was down for Danny Coulomb when he came back. So it's a little bit of a different scenario there. But still, the elbow is not a lot to mess around with. His strikeouts went down. His walks went up in those final couple of weeks of the season when he came back from that elbow issue. And so with the projected money being under $2 million, you'd think it's got to be that injury stuff. I mean, Webb has been really good since the Orioles claimed him off waivers in 2023 from the Angels. He pitched 22 innings down the stretch for the Orioles in 2023, had a 3.27 ERA. Remember, he had that long scoreless streak as soon as the Orioles picked him up, which was awesome to watch. And then he was just a really, really solid middle reliever for the Orioles this year. Webb threw 56 2/3 innings over 60 games, had a 3.02 ERA, good strikeout rate at 25%, walk rate at 11.4% was pretty high for Webb this year, and that may have been a factor in this decision as well. But he was just a good middle reliever, right? He had good stuff. It was fastball, sweeper, changeup. That changeup was one of the best changeups in all of baseball. In terms of run value from StatCast, his changeup was in the 91st percentile of basically effectiveness of all changeups in the majors. It allowed him as a righty to get lefties out at a high rate, which is really, really important now with the 3-batter minimum in Major League Baseball bullpen. So even though he was never the highest leverage guy, he got a couple of save chances for the Orioles this year when they had some bullpen injuries and the Craig Kimbrell ineffectiveness. But generally, he was just a good middle reliever. And for $1.7 million, generally, you are always going to bring back a good middle reliever for $1.7 million. But it's kind of the same line of thinking I had when the Orioles made that Danny Coulomb decision, is that I feel like maybe the O's were worried that that elbow has a little more damage to it. And, he's 31 years old, so he's not as old as Coulomb, but he is past age 30. And relievers are also volatile, right? And this is Webb, who's had injuries in his past. He did get Tommy John surgery back in 2015 when he was with the Braves. So he's had it once before. It's obviously been a while since that happened, but elbow issues cropping up again. You're worried about a second Tommy John potentially. And relievers are just super volatile year to year, especially when injury is involved. So you just kind of never know. And again, I have to think most of this was injury based, but the other part of this is, okay, you're looking at Webb, you're worried he's not going to be able to pitch a full season for you in 2025. He is also out of options. He is not able to just be sent to AAA if he's struggling. And this is something the Orioles bullpen dealt with in 2024. Most of their relievers were out of options. They couldn't just send them up and down, and they needed a little more roster flexibility in that bullpen. And it was trending towards being the same exact issue in 2025. Your only optionable relievers were going to be Felix Bautista and Yennier Cano, probably your best two guys who you're never going to send to AAA. You need a little more flexibility than that. And it kind of looked like we were going to get to the point where maybe Jacob Webb didn't have a bullpen spot anyway, because you're looking at Bautista, Cano, Dominguez, Soto, Perez as, 5 right there that are going to be in your pen. Probably Keegan Aiken, with the way he pitched this year, puts you at 6. Then maybe Albert Suarez gets pushed to the bullpen at 7. And Jacob Webb, probably projects as one of the 8 guys, probably that final name in there. You probably bump him ahead of guys like Aiken and Suarez in the pecking order. But if the Orioles add any kind of relief arms this offseason, that puts Webb, without this decision, a little more on the roster bubble. You've got a guy like Colin Selby in there who the Orioles really, really like. You're looking at some guys like Chase McDermott. Maybe he's a reliever to begin the year next year. It certainly wasn't a case like Coulomb where it felt like, hey, a healthy Coulomb is a lock to make the bullpen. A healthy Webb was not even a lock to be in the Orioles bullpen next year. And with the injury questions and the lack of options, that may have all come together for the Orioles to make this move. And again, this move still less surprising to me than the decision to let go of Danny Coulomb. But Jacob Webb was the only non-tender for the Orioles. The 12 other arbitration-eligible players were tendered a contract. We'll go through all of those decisions quickly coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Omaha Steaks. Nothing delivers comfort and joy quite like the unrivaled quality and taste of Omaha Steaks. This year, skip the holiday hustle and bustle and save 50% off site-wide during their cyber sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, get a $30 reward card when you shop early and score an extra $30 off with promo code MLB. With 5 generations of experience, Omaha Steaks consistently delivers the world's best steak experience, and their gifting experts have made it easy to deliver the perfect gift with thoughtfully curated gift packages starting at $89.99. From legendary steaks to mouthwatering desserts and more, save 50% off site-wide during the cyber sale at omahasteaks.com. Plus, our listeners get an extra $30 off with promo code MLB and a $30 reward card when you shop early. That's 50% off at omahasteaks.com and an extra $30 off with promo code MLB. Minimum purchase may apply. And this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by the DK Law Group. When you need a law firm, do you want the legal runaround or would you rather have a no-nonsense approach? Well, you get the latter with the DK Law Group. The DK Law Group specializes in real estate law, estate planning, business law, and family law. They're tech savvy, they treat their clients like family, and they focus on keeping your legal solutions simple. And one of the things you'll quickly notice with the DK Law Group is their transparent pricing. They believe in clarity and cost and that no one should be left in limbo. So contact DK Law Group today at dklawmd.com. And Locked On Orioles listeners can call today to schedule a free 30-minute consultation when you mention the tagline, Empowering Legacies. So as Jacob Webb became the Orioles' only guy that they non-tendered at the deadline on Friday, they tendered a contract to everybody else who was arbitration eligible. And we're going to kind of just go through every name who is in the arbitration process, give out their projected number from MLB trade rumors that they will make next year, and just briefly why the Orioles decided to tender a contract at that number. Starts with Gregory Soto, projected for $5.6 million last year. Yeah, he was not good right after the trade, but he was sneaky, maybe the Orioles' best reliever in September. He was great down the stretch. He could be their number one lefty, especially with Coulomb gone. I'm absolutely in on Gregory Soto. Cedric Mullins could still be traded, but he's never going to be a non-tender candidate. Even at a projected $8.7 million for next year, he could easily be the Orioles center fielder once again going into the year. Jorge Mateo, there was a question about, projected at $3.2 million, missed the final 2 months of the season after elbow surgery. Mike Elias did say recently that Mateo should be healthy for most, if not all, of the 162-game season. I think it's still in question whether or not he's ready for opening day, but even if he's not, he'll be ready shortly after. And it seems like to me, Mateo is at least still in the Orioles' plans for a bench role next season. Ryan Mountcastle, another guy who could be traded, but also is never going to be a non-tender candidate at $6.6 million. You're going to bring him back, maybe you deal him, but if you don't, hey, Wall's coming back in. He can be more productive for you certainly next season. Keegan Aiken projected for only $1.4 million. He was sneaky really good out of the pen last year, and I think could be an important reliever for the Orioles in 2025. Ramon Laureano tendered a contract projected to make $3.1 million. I mean, he certainly showed his worth down the stretch in the second half last year with Jordan Westburg out and how productive he was and how much worse the Orioles got when Arias also injured that ankle briefly. I think he's certainly going to be back in some sort of bench role for the Orioles. Tyler Wells projected at $2.1 million, only made 3 starts, had the Tommy John surgery. He's got plenty of years to go. He should come back kind of mid-season 2025. You're absolutely going to bring him back. Dean Kramer projected at $3.5 million. That's honestly pretty cheap for a guy who projects to be a solid number 5 starter in your rotation. That really is what Kramer's role should be for the rest of the time he's with the Orioles. Just a solid number 5 starter, and for $3.5 million, that is an easy yes for Dean Kramer. Adley Rutschman at $5.8 million. Duh. Even with a tough second half, he's one of the best catchers in the American League. Yeah. Kyle Bradish also projected at $2.1 million. Same issues as Tyler Wells. He had Tommy John surgery. He'll probably be back a little later than Wells, I would think. He might miss a good chunk to most, if not all, of the 2025 season. We'll kind of still see how that plays out, but obviously you're going to keep him around. And then one of the other guys who was a big question mark was Trevor Rogers, who the Orioles brought in via that trade for Norby and Stowers from the Marlins at the deadlines. Rogers had his struggles, but he had been really good early in his career. Orioles tried to fix him. He really struggled. He was sent down to AAA for the final month of the season, where he did pitch much better and was working on a lot of things, kind of tweaking his pitch mix. And there was some questions like, hey, are the Orioles just going to cut this guy loose? Absolutely not. He's got 2 more years of team control. It's only $2.8 million. They're not going to give up on this trade after 1/2 season. They're going to get him in that Orioles pitching lab this offseason and see what they can maybe turn him back into the old Trevor Rogers going into 2025. And then the last guy, which was the one player who I thought was the easiest non-tender candidate and actually who was given a contract, is Emmanuel Rivera. And not only that, not only did the Orioles tender him a contract, he is the first player in arbitration that the Orioles have actually already agreed to a deal with. So the O's announced they have agreed to pay Rivera $1 million, exactly on the dot, for 2025. He was projected for $1.4 million by MLB trade rumors. And I thought Rivera would kind of be a non-tender candidate because although he was good, right? The Orioles had Westburg and Arias injured. They needed some help at third base. They claimed him off waivers from the Marlins. And he was great. Like, he had a 166 WRC plus in 73 plate appearances down the stretch for the O's. He made the playoff roster. He got a postseason pinch hit at bat in game 1 against the Royals. Like, he was part of this team down the stretch, played really solid defense at both third base and first base for the Orioles. Like, he helped out this team. But then you look at the healthy Orioles and you're like, okay, Westburg, Arias, Mateo, Holiday, Henderson, Mayo, O'Hearn, Mountcastle. You're like, where in the world does Rivera play? And just because generally in his career hasn't been a very good hitter, although he was great for the O's, I just figured he's a non-tender guy. There's just no space to keep him around. But on the flip side, it seemed like the Orioles figured, hey, this is $1 million. This is nothing. If he can bottle up what he did for us down the stretch and continue to produce, maybe he can find his way onto this roster. Maybe we give him a shot in spring training in Sarasota and see what he can do. Now, he is out of options, so you can't just send him down to AAA. That was the other part of this decision. I was like, well, he'd have to get DFA'd, so there's no use in keeping him around. But this is a decision, which is a very small one, right? To guarantee $1 million to Emmanuel Rivera. This is a decision where you really have to remind yourself this is a different ownership group. This is our first offseason with David Rubenstein instead of John Angelos. And in the John Angelos days, you would have said, oh, this is an easy decision. Save $1.4 million or save $1 million, whatever it may be, and cut him loose. Now with Rubenstein, $1 million is nothing for this payroll. So he could compete for a utility spot in spring training, but the Orioles could easily just DFA Rivera at some point in the offseason when they add better players, and Rivera is someone who's taken up a spot on the 40-man roster, and they just DFA him because at this point it's like, let's keep him around for $1 million, make sure we don't lose him now, just in case we want to use him in spring training. But if we get to January and we make a big signing and we need to clear space on the roster, $1 million is nothing to us. We can easily cut him loose. That is where you have to kind of tweak your thinking about how the Orioles are running this team now, because $1 million is not a big decision anymore. It is not a big amount of money anymore for this ownership group. And that really is honestly a nice feeling to see the Orioles make this move and agree to terms with Rivera. So with those moves that the Orioles have made, they now have 38 players on their 40-man roster. So 2 open spots as they get towards Thanksgiving. But the Orioles were not the only team to non-tender players on Friday. There were a good chunk of them, and some of them, some really interesting new free agents. We'll get to which ones the Orioles could pursue to finish off the pod coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. That is a pretty good deal that you can take advantage of over at FanDuel. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. So as we talk about that non-tender deadline on Friday, there were plenty of other teams who also non-tendered some players and allowed some pretty intriguing free agents to hit the market. This is kind of the point once you pass that non-tender deadline where you finally have kind of your full spectrum of free agents, because there's always guys where, hey, you don't know they're going to hit free agency. And it's never the biggest names, right? Because if a guy is getting non-tendered, he's not going to be any kind of top 50 free agent out there. But he could certainly be an interesting player that could help your team. Maybe it's a cheaper team just non-tendering a player for money and a guy who could really help you. There are some of those in there. There are some of these guys who just kind of don't fit their older teams. Maybe we're going to make a little bit too much money, whatever it may be. Some interesting free agents out there, and I wanted to run through them. Now, they're mostly going to be pitchers, so I'm just going to start with the 2 position players I put on here. One is Ramon Laureano. He is a veteran right-handed hitting outfielder who was non-tendered by the Braves. He had been with the Guardians for a little while after being with the Athletics. He was terrible with the Guardians last year, had a 173 average. They released him. The Braves picked him up midseason because the Braves had a million injuries. And then he returned, and in over 200 plate appearances, he hit 296 with a 129 WRC plus, including a 305 average against left-handers, had a 13% barrel rate, which is great. He's still solid defensively in all 3 outfield positions, still has a cannon for an arm. He was super well known for his defense back in Oakland. It's taken a little bit of a step back now because he's getting a little bit older, but if the Orioles are kind of looking for that 4th, 5th outfielder addition, if Laureano's okay with that role, being on a good team, he could be a perfect fit for the O's for a cheap deal this offseason. The other one is Brian De La Cruz, another right-handed hitting outfielder, was with the Marlins, traded to the Pirates at the deadline. He had like elite hard hit and batted ball data in Miami in 2022, but then it just kind of fell off a cliff the last 2 years. And then he had a 77 WRC plus this year for the full season. But that was a combination of him being like a league average hitter, maybe slightly below with the Marlins, and then having a 32 WRC plus in 168 plate appearances with the Pirates after the trade. He was terrible, but he's only 27. He hits some lefties at times. Maybe a cheap option for the Orioles to bring in. But now let's move to the pitchers. First one is Griffin Canning, right-handed starting pitcher who the Braves acquired via trade this offseason for Jorge Soler, and then just immediately non-tendered him. Now he's coming off a bad season. Had a 5.19 ERA and 31 starts for the Angels, but He's been a little bit durable. He's got a nasty changeup. Maybe someone the O's could bring in and kind of hone that stuff. Everyone's been talking about, hey, the Angels never got what they could out of Griffin Canning. And speaking of the Angels not getting all they could out of a guy, Patrick Sandoval, the left-handed starter, was non-tendered by the Angels. Now, some of this was injury related. He had Tommy John surgery in June, so he may only be able to pitch a little. I think the reports are he may not pitch at all in 2025. So maybe the O's aren't interested, but it seems like a team could give him a 2-year deal to help him rehab the Tommy John and then get him back in 2026. He was okay in 2023, but 2 years ago, he had a 2.91 ERA in 28 starts for the Angels. Avoids hard contact, has an awesome changeup, really, really good stuff. Could be intriguing. One of the most wild and honestly idiotic front office moves of the offseason, it belongs to the Nationals so far. The Washington Nationals non-tendered their closer, right-handed pitcher Kyle Finnegan, who had one more year on his contract before he became a free agent. Now, Finnegan was having a great year, racking up the saves. Yeah, maybe the underlying data wasn't as good as he looked, so maybe there was a little bit of smoke and mirrors with Finnegan, but you couldn't argue he was at least a good reliever last year for the Nationals. And he was one of the trade candidates at the deadline. He was drawing interest from teams. I'm sure the Orioles at least checked in on what he would cost. I put him on one of my top 6 wish lists for the Orioles to acquire at the trade deadline in terms of relievers. And then he just gets non-tendered. He was good last year. He was one of the top bullpen arms available at the deadline. The Nationals decided to hold on to him. It's a fastball at 97. It's a splitter. It's good ground ball rates. And the Nationals, they don't trade him. They hold on to him. You're thinking, oh, that's because the Nats want to compete next year. They want to have Kyle Finnegan be their closer. And then they just non-tender him and get nothing for him, where they easily could have traded him at the deadline to get something. Or to be quite honest with you, maybe they would have gotten a little less, but they could have at least traded him this offseason and gotten something for him with one more year remaining. And they just non-tender him? Bizarre decision by the Washington Nationals, but that's the kind of decisions that Nationals front office tends to make. Speaking of closers who are out there, Jordan Romano is out there as well. You may know him as the Blue Jays closer. Well, he had a lot of elbow issues this year. Pitched only 13 2/3 innings for Toronto this season. That's most of the reason why he was non-tender with just 1 year left on his deal. Now, he didn't get Tommy John surgery. The Blue Jays were actually kind of targeting a September return for him last year, but they were just out of it, didn't want to risk it, so he ended up not coming back. But he's been throwing. He's still throwing. He seems like he's trying to get ready to be good for opening day 2025. Now, with the elbow injury, you never know what the stuff looks like, how good he's going to be, whatever it may be. But 2020 to 2023, 200 innings, a 2.29 ERA, and over 11 strikeouts per 9 for Jordan Romano with the Blue Jays. He was one of the best closers in baseball. Fastball slider guy, good velocity, crazy extension down the mound, which makes him super hard to hit. If he's anything close to what he had been before the elbow issues, that's a guy a lot of teams are going to be all over. Another reliever that's interesting is Hoby Milner, left-handed pitcher who was non-tendered by the Brewers. Might be the funkiest sidearm lefty in baseball. Doesn't throw with hard velocity. It's like a mid to high 80s sinker, but he avoids hard contact. He gets a lot of ground balls, and he's had a weird 2 years with the Brewers. So Hoby Milner in 2023 had a 1.82 ERA in 64 innings pitched. He was one of the Brewers' best relievers. He was just awesome for them. Then this year, he also threw 64 innings, but he had a 4.73 ERA. His ERA jumped by 3 runs from year to year. But the interesting thing to look at is his FIP, his fielding independent pitching, which looks a little bit more on what should have happened, how your defense plays, how your batted balls looked. His FIP in 2023, when he had the 1.8 ERA, was 3.13. His FIP this year was 3.14. So if you look under the hood, he was essentially the same pitcher in 2023 and 2024, but his ERA jumped by 3 runs. What does that tell you? He was really lucky 2 years ago. He was really unlucky this year. Generally, he's going to be a 3 ERA guy who gets a lot of ground balls. That is still a guy who can help your bullpen. I would not be surprised if the Orioles were in on Hoby Milner. 2 more guys. Brent Honeywell, right-handed pitcher of the Dodgers, was non-tendered. We saw him pitch in the postseason. He had that really bad outing in the World Series, but he ate up some quality innings for the Dodgers this year. He can go multiple innings. He's had a whole bunch of injuries in his career, but listen, he pitched in the playoffs. He won a World Series, and he throws one of the only screwballs in Major League Baseball. So, yeah, why not take a shot? And the last one is Cal Quantrill. A very Rockies move here, similar to what the Nats did. Quantrill was drawing trade interest at the deadline. The Rockies decided to hold on to him. He was having a good first half. He was pretty bad in the second half. And then the Rockies decide to non-tender him instead of getting anything for him. He would just be kind of a buy low depth starter who the O's could bring in to not guarantee a rotation spot for, but have at least compete for a rotation spot in spring training of 2025. But that's the list of interesting non-tender guys. There's a couple more that have some Orioles connections as well, but I'm going to get to them on tomorrow's episode. When we are back, some Orioles news and notes. Going to take a look at the Orioles bullpen right now because they've let go of Danny Coulombe and Jacob Webb. How is it now shaping out? Do the Orioles even more so need to add a reliever this offseason? We'll talk about that tomorrow. We'll also chat about another minor league signing by the Orioles. A former top prospect is reportedly at this point joining the O's on a minor league deal, and got a lot of former Oriole news to talk about. Austin Slater has signed elsewhere. And speaking of non-tenders, Austin Hayes is a free agent again. We'll get to all that and more on tomorrow's episode. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.